we'll go ahead and get started. The way these things generally work is other people will trickle in as we race along. We'll catch them up as we go. Thanks everybody for joining us tonight for our monthly Watershed Wednesday, which is our monthly seminar series. Although seminar sounds a little formal and stuffy, it's a monthly get-together of supporters of AWS and guests to talk about issues around the watershed, interesting stories that have happened recently, or background on a lot of things. Or in the recent months, we've had Watershed Wednesdays on the ins and outs of recycling, the new board game, bird board game, Wingspread, I think it's called, which was invented by a denizen of the watershed. And tonight, we're going to talk about the Clean Water Act. As many of you know, the Clean Water Act just turned 50 on October 18th. And I think it's an act that's worthy of celebration. It is been instrumental in a lot of the improvements in water quality in the US over the last 50 years, as well as it's made significant contributions to wetlands conservation and to river cleanup and restoration efforts around the country. We have a very special guest who's going to talk with us about the Clean Water Act today, which I'll introduce in a minute after I give you a little background. My name is Chris Williams. I'm the president and CEO of the Anacostia Watershed Society, and it's a great pleasure to be with you all tonight. Many of you who are on this call who have met me know me as the suave and sophisticated president of AWS, but at one time I was a bumbling young law student, just trying to make my way in the world. And at that time, I met our guest, who has been a friend and mentor of mine ever since. But we'll talk a little bit more about that as we race along. During that time in my career, actually the first thing I did in my first internship while I was still in law school was work on a Clean Water Act case. And this was about 30 years ago. So I have a long history with the Clean Water Act, both professionally and, sort of as a conservationist, just watching the progress that it's made over time. The court does a number of really important things since its inception back in 1972. It prohibits point source pollution without a permit and requires best available technology be used to prevent pollution discharges from factories, industrial works, sewage works, what have you. And that requirement for a continual improvement, if you will, in the emissions of polluting entities at point sources has led to significant improvements in water quality across the United States. By one estimate, it's reduced pollutants in rivers and streams of the US by about 700 million tons per year, and has led to significant water quality improvements. The Act also prohibits the dredge and fill of wetlands without a permit. And again, this permitting process has acted as a brake to slow down the destruction of wetlands across the country that has led to the loss of almost 50% of wetlands across the country. On the proactive side, it established grant and loan programs that have invested billions of dollars in stormwater management, wastewater treatment, conservation of streams, wetlands, and estuaries around the country. And the provisions of the Act has created programs across the country to conserve particular bodies of water. For example, the Chesapeake Bay program, which many of you are familiar with, and which the Anacostia Watershed Society cooperates with and works with, is a product of language under the Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act is national in scope. It's had a lot of national impacts, but it's also had local impacts across the country for reasons which we'll get into when we talk about the details of the Act. The legal action under the Act has, in the Anacostia Watershed, legal action under the Clean Water Act has been instrumental in halting discharges of pollution from the Navy Yard, from PEPCO, from WSSC, the Washington Suburban Sanitary Commission, from Washington Gas. Action under the Clean Water Act, legal action brought by the Anacostia Watershed Society and partners, led to actions that evolved into the Clean Rivers Project, which is the massive project to create tunnels to catch sewage and other waste from combined sewage overflows and direct them directly into Blue Plains instead of dumping them into the river. This massive multi-billion-dollar tunnel project, which has already been instrumental in reducing sewage in the Anacostia by up to 90%, was a direct result of action by AWS and others taken under the Clean Water Act. Our guest tonight, we're going to discuss the Clean Water Act with, is Bob Irvin. He has had an incredible career in conservation. He has been everything from a Justice Department lawyer to a counsel to the National Wildlife Federation. He was the director of conservation for the Defenders of Wildlife. He was counsel to the Environment Public Works Committee of the U.S. Senate, which, among other things, had jurisdiction and has jurisdiction over the Clean Water Act. And most recently, until his recent retirement, he was the president and CEO of American Rivers, a national organization dedicated to the conservation of rivers and clean water. And as you can imagine, in that capacity, he had a lot of interaction with the Clean Water Act. Bob is also an old friend and mentor of mine. As I said, back in my law school days, I met Bob and took a class from him, and he was really instrumental in starting me on the road to being a professional conservationist myself. So I'm really looking forward to discussing with him the Clean Water Act and hear his thoughts on it. So welcome, Bob.
Thanks, Chris. It's a pleasure to be with everyone.
So Bob, before we jump into our discussion, fill in some blanks for me. Is there anything I left out, anything you want to emphasize about your career and how it sort of led you on the path toward working on clean water and endangered species and all sorts of other things?
Well, I guess the one thing that I would note is that in many ways, my career in conservation came about because of concerns over clean water. I grew up, my dad was in the Air Force, and so I grew up all over, but the one constant was that I spent part of every summer at my grandparents' farm in the mountains of eastern Kentucky. And this is the farm where my mom grew up. And there was a little creek that flowed through the farm, Acup Creek. And when my mom was a child back in the 40s and early 50s, she could play in that creek, and it was full of minnows and dace and crayfish and all kinds of things. And she would tell me about that. But by the time I was a kid there in the 1960s, early 1970s, I had to stay out of that creek because it was so polluted. It was polluted by acid mine drainage from coal mines in the area. And at that time, there were no public sewers in that area or any kind of sewage treatment. And so people just had, outhouses along the creek. And so it was polluted with sewage as well. And you just couldn't go in it. And it really bugged me. It bugged me to think that this really beautiful little stream that my mom could play in was off limits to me because of pollution. And it really got me thinking, even as a child, I want to do something about this. And so as I started to think about what career I would pursue, I knew I wanted to do something to protect the environment. And I eventually got a forestry degree. And then I was very interested in policy and law with the idea of really trying to protect the environment, save the earth. And so I pursued that, but it really does harken back to water pollution before the Clean Water Act.
Before we go on, two important facts about Bob I forgot to mention. One is a passionate angler. And if this conversation were about angling and fishing instead of the Clean Water Act, he'd be even more enthusiastic than he is already. And number two, he is a strong supporter of the Anacostia Watershed Society, for which I am very grateful. He actually lives at the headwaters of the Anacostia River up in Olney, Maryland. So Bob, you may have already answered this question with your previous response, but was it this childhood experience with the stream that really inspired your career in conservation?
Yeah, that sort of gave me the spark. I just love the outdoors also, growing up and continue to. And I'm glad you mentioned that I'm a passionate angler. I love to fly fish. And if this were about fly fishing, you would never get me to shut up, as Chris well knows. But I I've always loved science, and then policy issues really excited me. So pursuing a career as an environmental lawyer working to protect the environment was really my dream, and I was fortunate enough to get to do those things. And along the way, I got to meet and, as you say, mentor some great people like you, Chris. It's a real pleasure for me to see you leading the Anacostia Watershed Society, and it's a real pleasure to support it because I care deeply about rivers and streams. And as you said, I live at the headwaters, the very headwaters of the Anacostia River. So it's nice to be a part of that.
Yeah, yeah, I had similar experiences in terms of my inspirations for a career. I always loved the outdoors. I always loved critters. There was a stream that ran. It was in a small canyon just next to my house that I used to play in. I mean, looking back now, it was probably an irrigation canal, but still, it was a freshwater stream that sort of started my passion for critters and for looking out for them. So, Bob, tell us about some of your most important and influential professional encounters with the Clean Water Act. This will sort of set the stage for our discussion.
Well, it's interesting because, water has been sort of the pun intended, the constant flowing through my career. I mean, I specialized in wildlife law, and particularly endangered species. And you can't protect wildlife if you don't protect the habitat, and the habitat always includes a big water component. And so, when I was a young lawyer working at the National Wildlife Federation, I worked on wetlands cases there, and I remember I had one case involving there was an effort to build a third major airport outside of Houston, Texas, and they wanted to build it right in this huge wetland area that was a huge habitat for wintering waterfowl like snow geese and other species. And I worked with local activists there to stop that, and we stopped it because it was wetlands, and the Clean Water Act provided the means to do that. And throughout my career, there have been similar instances. And as you mentioned, I worked on the Senate Environment Public Works Committee, where I was the senior counsel for Fish and Wildlife. And part of my responsibility was the wetlands provisions of the Clean Water Act. And at that time, there was an effort to renew the Clean Water Act. And whenever Congress does that, there's an opportunity to make changes to it. And those changes can be good or they can be bad. And so my job was to make sure that if the Senate was going to enact any changes to the act, that they remain protective of wetlands and water generally. And while I was there, we were successful in doing that. And indeed, Congress has not enacted any major changes to the Clean Water Act in over 30 years at this point. But there's always pressure to do so. And then, just as my career continued, ultimately as the president and CEO of American Rivers, everything was about water. And we used the Clean Water Act, as you well know, because you led the conservation program when we were there working together, Chris. We used the Clean Water Act to address things like getting obsolete and unsafe dams removed that were causing problems for rivers, or restoring streams, protecting wild and scenic rivers that had outstanding water quality, and protecting urban waters, and working with communities to really connect with their rivers. And I'll just say one more thing about this. When I was at American Rivers, we sponsored the National River Cleanup program, where we partnered with local groups all over the country and river cleanups. And one of the first river cleanups that I participated in personally was on the Anacostia River in partnership with the Anacostia Watershed Society. So I've seen firsthand the great work that AWS does.
Well, thanks. Thanks for those kind words about AWS. And it's interesting to learn that your connection to AWS actually predates mine a little bit. So, with all these experiences you've had in all these different capacities, as you worked on the Senate, where you worked in the Senate rather, where you were actually in a position to work with members to make changes to the law or to prevent changes to the law. You've been a lobbyist on the outside. You've been a litigator. You've been an advocate in all sorts of ways. In your experience, what are the most important, what are the most impactful provisions of the law, particularly other than the obvious ones of preventing point source pollution and protecting wetlands?
Yeah, well, I think one thing that is really important to know about the Clean Water Act is that it really set a very high bar for what we want the rivers and streams of this country to look like and to be like. It basically set the bar that all the waters in this country ought to be fishable and swimmable, that we need to protect the biological integrity and chemical integrity of these rivers and streams. And it's really important to have that very strong goal. And the Act has not fulfilled that goal, but rivers and streams and lakes in this country are demonstrably better off as a result of the Clean Water Act than before that law was enacted. I mean, one of the stories about what led to the Clean Water Act is that when the Cuyahoga River and other rivers in this country caught fire in the late 1960s, that really galvanized attention, because let's face it, none of us want our rivers to be on fire. And that really brought attention to the need to address this issue, and got Congress by huge bipartisan majorities to enact the Clean Water Act. So I think setting that high bar and that goal has been really important. Obviously, setting up a permit system to address point sources of pollution, the Clean Water Act has done an excellent job on that. And as you noted in your opening remarks, it has helped slow the loss of wetlands in this country by setting up a permit system for that as well. And I think those are really important successes under the Act, but there's still a lot to be done.
Yeah, among my favorite provisions are there's a section called 401, which requires that projects that the federal government is going to undertake somewhere need to get a water quality certification from state authorities, or in the case of the DC, the district authority. And you and I have worked together on ensuring that part of the law was preserved and implemented properly, because it really provides for the sort of local input, and provides a local role in decision making.
Yeah.
So I think that's tremendously important.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I completely agree with you on that. And, I think sometimes you can measure the importance of a particular provision of a law by how strong the opponents of it are. And there was a determined effort in the previous administration to undermine state and tribal authority under 401, which would have also meant undermining the authority of everyday citizens to have input into protecting our rivers and streams.
And then as an attorney who has worked in the many capacities you've worked in, obviously the citizen suit provision has to be one of your favorites.
Yeah, it is. you know, several of our environmental laws have citizen suit provisions, and this is something that is real. It may be, if it's not unique to American law, American law has certainly led the way in providing these opportunities for citizens to take polluters to court, or in some cases, government agencies that are failing to carry out their duties to court. And that's been a really important provision, and a number of things under the Clean Water Act have happened as a result of citizen suits. I mean, I think it was unclear early on under the Clean Water Act whether stormwater could be addressed under the Clean Water Act, and I believe it was a citizen suit that actually helped bring that about.
Yeah, that's right. And the strides that AWS has helped make under the Clean Water Act that I mentioned before, the actions against PEPCO and WSSC, and the long 20-year legal action that led to the Clean Waters Project, those were all done under the citizen suit provision.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it was referring to the Clean Water Act specifically, but I remember reading that a citizen suit provision under the ESA or the Clean Water Act or something, it allowed people to act as their own attorney general. Mm-hmm. Essentially saying that if the government wasn't enforcing these laws themselves, an ordinary citizen could step in and do so.
Yeah.
And I think that's just a far-reaching, and as it's turned out, a very powerful provision of the Clean Water Act.
It really is.
So you know, we've talked a lot about the successes under the Act and the sort of glorious, you know, progress we've made in terms of rivers and streams. And I don't mean to denigrate that; it's been tremendous. But what are the shortcomings? Where, in your view, has the Act, either because of the way it's written or because of the way it's been implemented, has fallen short?
Yeah. Well, I think that, you know, there are some areas that were sort of left unaddressed under the Clean Water Act. The focus was on point sources of pollution, whatever was coming out of pipes, and requiring permits to address that, and establishing standards for you know, what technology ought to be used and what the water quality standards were. But what and the Act has done a great job in that arena, but what it had failed to address were non-point sources of pollution. And so things like stormwater runoff from urban streets and roofs and buildings, agricultural runoff, all of the stuff that we put on our farms to grow crops, not all of it is great for water quality, and when it rains, it gets washed into the streams as well. And so I think those areas in particular are areas where we need to do more going forward. And then in the wetlands arena, there has been a debate. I mentioned the case I worked on at the National Wildlife Federation. Well, that was in 1989 when I was working on that, and that back then people were debating what waters are covered by the Clean Water Act for purposes of requiring a permit, and are wetlands covered by that? Are intermittent streams, are isolated bodies of water that aren't connected on the surface to another body of water, are they covered by the Clean Water Act? And this all gets, as you well know, Chris, into, you know, constitutional law under the Commerce Clause, and whether Congress has the authority to regulate these things. And it has been a constant battle for going on almost 40 years now over the scope of that, and a political battle in Congress, a battle in the courts. Every time an administration comes in of a different party, the weight shifts back and forth as to whether to protect more waters or less waters, and that's an area that is, you know, could really use some clarification and some strengthening of protection for waters of the U.S.
Yeah, I think that's right. And we probably would have gotten into these battles over the Commerce Clause and what constitutes the waters of the United States anyway. But one of the places where I would have liked to have seen the act written a little more clearly is the preambular language to the act actually has some good language about freshwater ecosystems, but the actual prohibitions and legally enforceable aspects of the act don't really talk much about ecosystems. They talk about water quality, they talk about wetlands. They don't talk about things like intermittent streams or ephemeral streams or prairie potholes or any of the other aspects of freshwater ecosystems that are so important to not just protecting those individual things because of their inherent value, but protecting the freshwater systems of which all of those are part. And while science, and I think to a large extent activism, has really embraced the ecosystem approach to conservation, the language of the statute sort of lags behind that a bit.
Yeah, it definitely does. And having worked on Capitol Hill and drafted legislative language, I know how hard it can be to really express exactly what members of Congress have in mind in putting these statutes together, and then the courts have to interpret them, and so things get sometimes they get pretty far astray of what was originally intended. But again, I have to say, overall, I think the Clean Water Act has just been a tremendous law. And there's one other aspect that you alluded to that it's not always the most exciting thing to talk about, but it's probably in many ways the most important part of the Clean Water Act, and that's the money. I mean, the federal money that gets channeled to states and tribes and to clean up rivers and streams, or into the case of the Chesapeake Bay program or similar ecosystem protection programs around the country is just tremendous. And the Clean Water Act provides the framework and the imperative for doing what I think the American people know is so important for them and their children, which is to have rivers and streams and lakes that we can all enjoy in all the ways that we enjoy water.
So I want the rest of the group in on this conversation, if possible. So folks on the call, does anybody have any questions about what you've heard so far, or any questions that you want to pose to Bob and or I about the Clean Water Act or freshwater ecosystem conservation or river conservation in general? Any questions or observations, experiences? Well, there's Deborah Privola and David Blockstein. You have a question?
Yeah, we do. So you've talked about the past 50 years. What about the next 50 years?
You're anticipating one of my prepared questions, but good for you.
First of all, how fun it is to see you, David, and to see Deborah. We all worked together over the years in various ways. It's just great to see you guys. Next 50 years, well, I mean, I do think that addressing non-point sources is clearly important. We're going to have to do something about agricultural runoff, and that's always a politically dicey proposition because people who live and operate farms and ranches don't really like the government telling them what to do and how they operate, and they have been quite powerful politically in winning exemptions from the Clean Water Act and other laws in doing that. And I think what we've learned is that you need to have some really good incentive programs to bring farmers and ranchers along, because I think most people actually do want to do the right thing. Nobody wants to live by a polluted stream. So good incentive programs are really important in engaging people who are in the agricultural community and helping to shape and implement programs is also really important as well. And so I think we'll continue to see more of that. I think we are going to have to, at some point, really bite the bullet and have some legislative clarification of what constitutes the waters that we want to protect and how extensive that needs to be. And it is my hope that it will be very extensive and extend to, headwater streams and intermittent streams and all of the water bodies that ultimately form the larger rivers and flow into the bays and oceans. But going back and forth every 4 years, depending on who's in the White House and who gets appointed to the Supreme Court, just doesn't seem like a very effective way of regulating these issues. And the one thing we haven't talked about is tonight, but has got to be at the top of everyone's mind, is climate change. And it is the issue of the immediate future and over the next 50 years and beyond. And having healthy rivers and streams is absolutely essential to mitigating the impacts of climate change. I mean, if wildlife doesn't have healthy aquatic ecosystems to move within, they're not going to be able to move in response to changing temperatures. And, by the same token, we can't have healthy rivers and streams if we don't address the causes of climate change. They are inextricably linked. And so I think that that's got to be a focus moving forward as well.
Just to second something that Bob said, it's been, Bob and I, in various capacities, have worked on with the legislature, with Congress, to either protect the Clean Water Act from changes or to promote changes that we think would improve the act. And it's largely been stalemate over the decades for a variety of reasons. And my hope is that we can break that stalemate at some point, because I would love to see the Act's definition of waters of the United States clarified, and to include things like a very important issue here locally, vernal pools. In the remnant forests of the Anacostia Watershed, there are these wonderful vernal pools, which are essentially ephemeral wetlands that fill up after rain events, that are incredibly important habitat for frogs and salamanders and other amphibians, as well as small fishes that live their whole life cycle in these vernal pools. And they really are remarkable natural features of the watershed that it's hard to figure out how to protect, because they really sort of fall through the regulatory cracks of the Clean Water Act, as well as local laws and regulations. So some clarity on protecting those sorts of resources would be hugely helpful, and a great boon to the Anacostia watershed. Any other questions? All right, think about it for a little while while I ask another. Bob, you started to talk about this a little bit, but maybe you could just expand on this a little bit. As you mentioned before, the Act had very ambitious goals, very ambitious benchmarks for cleaning up the waters of the United States. In fact, the original language of the Act called for the waters of the US to be fishable and swimmable by 1983, and for pollutant discharges to be eliminated by 1985. Obviously, we didn't quite make it, but we're still working on it. So as you look back on your extensive experience with the Act, and going back even further than that, reflect a little bit on the Act's most important successes and its most important failures.
Yeah. Well, the first thing I should say is that it's probably a good thing for me personally that the goals of 1983 and 1985 weren't achieved, because I graduated from law school in 1983, so I probably would have been out of a job if all of those had been satisfied by then. But I think, looking over the history of the act, um, it, the regulation of point source pollution through permits has been tremendously successful. And you and I, Chris, have both heard people a little older than us tell stories of when they were growing up. And I remember one person telling me about growing up in Massachusetts, in a town that had a lot of factories, and they said you could tell what they were making at the factory by the color of the river on any particular day. Because the stuff just got dumped straight into the river. And one day the river would be orange, and another day it would be, red or blue, or I mean, it's just this array of colors and rivers catching fire. And that stuff doesn't happen anymore. In fact, when there is some major spill into a river, it's a big deal. And everybody knows about it. And it's an embarrassment to the company that does it. And they usually end up paying some big fine as a result of the Clean Water Act. And to me, that the Act's major success has been it has changed the entire approach to how we treat our rivers and streams in this country, and the mindset of how they ought to be treated. And I just don't, I think you can't ignore that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that the law, and I think this is true of a lot of environmental laws, they not only set down rules and regulations, but they change the attitude, they change the perception of the behavior. As I mentioned in an article I wrote about the Clean Water Act that was in the newsletter, prior to the passage of the Clean Water Act, sometimes people actually thought of a polluted river as kind of a point of civic pride, because it illustrated that we had a strong economy and an active industry, and et cetera, et cetera. And I don't think anybody thinks that anymore. Yeah. And I think that's partially due to the activities of the environmental movement, but it's also due to the fact that we have made illegal, and therefore made sort of unethical and unthinkable levels of pollution that before were just simply accepted. And I think the Clean Water Act has made a big contribution to that.
And it's a relatively short time period. As I was thinking about our conversation tonight, I was reflecting on the main author of the Clean Water Act was Senator Edmund Muskie of Maine. And as a kid, I mean, I remember Edmund Muskie. I remember him running for president in 1972, and Richard Nixon was really worried about him. He thought he could lose to him, and did everything he could to sabotage his campaign. And then there was a staff person who worked for Senator Muskie named Leon Billings, and he was the staffer who did most of the writing of the Clean Water Act. And when I worked in the Senate, which was in the early 90s, I actually met Leon Billings. By then he was, working as a lawyer lobbyist in Washington. But it's just amazing to me that this law that is now 50 years old, that has accomplished so much, but it was a relatively short period of time, and some of the people that were involved in it, were still with us until not too long ago.
Yeah. So you're an attorney by training. I'm an attorney by training, but don't worry, everybody, we're still okay guys. And as an attorney, you know better than most that a law is really only as effective as its implementation. So in your view, how have the legislative and legal battles over the Act's language and authority and reach, some of which we've mentioned already, how do you think that's helped or hampered its effectiveness over the past 50 years?
Well, I think it has helped and it has hampered. I mean, certainly, battles over the scope of the law in the context of wetlands, or in the context of whether stormwater can be regulated under the Clean Water Act. Those battles have at times set back what you and I would like to view as environmental progress. But it's kind of like my favorite quote from Martin Luther King Jr. is that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I think it's the same with the Clean Water Act. The achievement of the goals of the Clean Water Act are going to take a long time. They already have, and they continue to, but it definitely bends towards healthier rivers and streams. And we're seeing that I think, the role of citizens under the Clean Water Act, whether it's through citizen suits or just activism through organizations like AWS, is critical. And the opportunities for citizen engagement in the permitting process, or just in terms of bringing pressure to bear on the agencies charged with implementing the act, whether it's the EPA or the Corps of Engineers, is really critical to the success of the act. And as you mentioned, the actions that AWS has taken to address combined sewer overflows, you can just see how important that's been in the District of Columbia. And before we got on, I was talking with a couple of your staff about one of my favorite subjects, which is baseball. And the fact that Nationals Park is located on the Anacostia River, I think, is a testament to the Clean Water Act and the activism of citizens in DC. Because if the progress in cleaning up the Anacostia had not been made, I can assure you that they would never have placed this gem of a baseball stadium on that river.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And the actions under the Clean Water Act that local citizens and local groups like AWS, that's not history. I mean, that's happening right now today. As a matter of fact, just yesterday, I was on a conference call with some folks from DOEE, the Department of Energy and the Environment. We were talking about whether or not we were getting inordinate numbers of, whether or not we were getting some significant dumping of sewage by local marinas along the Anacostia. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that they recommended to us, that they gave us a name of somebody at EPA to go and talk to. Well, the reason you go and talk to somebody at EPA about this stuff is because EPA implements the Clean Water Act. And that's sort of your first stop when you want to talk to a federal official about potential violations under the Clean Water Act. So Clean Water Act is alive and functioning, and we're still working with it today in order to keep the rivers, keep the waters of the Anacostia fishable and swimmable, etc.
And that's why I support the Anacostia Watershed Society, Chris. You guys,
right on cue, Bob. Well done.
You're doing great work.
So while we're talking about bending to and against justice, this is sort of an unscripted question, but I wanted to see if you had any thoughts on this. As you know, the Supreme Court opened its term this year hearing arguments of a case brought essentially against the Clean Water Act to try to narrow the reach of waters of the United States. Well, to back up for a second, as you mentioned, there's been a 30-year plus debate about the scope of the waters of the United States. Does that mean, and waters of the United States are often described as waters that are navigable. And what does navigable mean? Does it mean where a boat can go? And if a boat can't go there, it's not protected under the Clean Water Act? And right now, as we speak, the court is considering whether to take a broad or a very narrow definition of waters of the United States. And a very narrow definition would probably leave out all of these sorts of things we've been talking about: intermittent streams, vernal pools, prairie potholes, ephemeral streams. What do you think? What's your prognostication of what's going to happen as a result of this case?
I'm really worried because with a 6-3 majority, on the Supreme Court, the proponents of limiting federal environmental laws have the upper hand. And the very fact that they took this case is an indication of where it's likely to go, because the issue of defining what waters are subject to the Clean Water Act is something that EPA is actually working on regulations on, because in the previous administration, they issued very restrictive regulations. And in the administration before that, in the Obama administration, they issued broader regulations to protect a broader class of water. So this is going back and forth between administrations. And, you know, I'm sure that there are some on the Supreme Court who say, well, let's just settle this and decide it. But is that really the role of the Supreme Court, which is not made up of experts in aquatic ecology or you know, the chemical makeup of rivers and streams? And but I think, as they have demonstrated in other contexts, that with the 6-3 majority, they are willing to reach out and actually decide things that previous courts would have been a little more careful about taking the reins for. And so I am worried and concerned about it. And if in fact we get a decision from the Supreme Court that dramatically restricts the scope of waters that are protected under the Clean Water Act, then the recourse is going to be in Congress, and that takes a while, because the majorities are not there right now to make changes that will be very protective of waters. So it's going to be a problem.
Yeah, and it reflects, in my view, this decades-long failure by Congress to address this question, because it really is. Congress is really where the answer to this lies, because the EPA, as you said, the EPA sort of gone back and forth on this based on whatever administration's in power. But even if you get the EPA creates, it's still subject to and vulnerable to litigation because Congress didn't clarify.
Yeah.
So
and I mean, you know, let's be honest, Congress reflects the American people. I mean, there's sometimes certain elements more than others, but ultimately it's the voters who decide who's in Congress and push for issues. And this kind of goes back to the question that David and Deborah were posing about the next 50 years. And, you know, this is where the generations that are taking power over the next 50 years really need to speak out and make sure that they are electing members of Congress who recognize the need to take strong action to protect clean water, to address climate change, to protect endangered species, all of the environmental imperatives that are going to be so important over the next 50 years.
So I have one more question for you, Bob, but before I get to that, I want to open up to the floor again. Does anyone else on the call have a question or a thought or an observation that you want to share with Bob? He's a nice guy, won't bite.
And I'd love to hear anyone else's thoughts on this. You've been listening
Yeah.
to me, so, you know, share your thoughts where you think things are going or ought to go.
I'm glad you're optimistic about the ARC going the right direction, but I'm concerned, given climate change, like you mentioned, and I'm involved with monitoring some tributaries in Montgomery County,
Mhm.
and just seeing the poor health of those, how deeply eroded some of these streams are. So, I mean, I know the majorities aren't there in Congress, but any thoughts about what to do?
Just, I guess, two things. First of all, I am an optimist, and as you know, one time my sister asked me, because I was working on these endangered species cases with wildlife that was on the brink of extinction. She's like, how can you stay optimistic about this? And I said, because you have to be optimistic. Otherwise you couldn't do this work if you did, if you gave in to despair. But I'm optimistic because I actually see, I have great hope in the generation that is about to take over for all of us, and seeing the concern that they have for the planet and for their fellow human beings. And that really makes me optimistic about the future. And in terms of what you're seeing on the ground, yeah, there is a lot of environmental degradation out there, but there's also a lot of reason for hope. I mean, if you had been in this area 100 years ago, you would have seen a lot less forest, because everything had been cleared for farms. And so the forest cover is actually greater now in this part of the country, and certainly in New England, than it was 100 years ago. And that's better for birds and wildlife, and for the health of streams. So that's an encouraging sign. Obviously, we continue to deal with a lot of rampant development, overdevelopment in some instances, but we've also put in place a lot of provisions to address some of the causes of pollution. I mean, Montgomery County actually has some pretty good and strong stormwater standards for new development. If you look at when a new shopping center or parking lot goes in now, what you'll often see is that there are rain gardens and areas to allow stormwater to be treated naturally before it ends up in the pipes and ultimately in the Chesapeake Bay. It's not perfect, but it's going in the right direction, and it's incumbent on all of us to continue to push for stronger protections like that, so that we can leave a world and neighborhoods for our kids and our grandkids that they actually can make further progress with.
Also, I have comments in the chat that is also AWS's work, and references the Maryland Stormwater Management Act of 2017, which is an act that we lobbied for and helped get enacted.
Yeah.
So anybody else? Questions or observations? Well, Deborah, you swiped my last question. Thanks a lot. So I've made up a new one on the fly. So Bob, you have talked about the Clean Water Act largely on the national scale and its impacts locally. And you, in your career, has largely been with sort of on the national level, working for the Senate, for Defenders, for American Rivers. But in those jobs, you've also worked with and provided a lot of support to local activists. So as you sort of look back on that experience and think about the future, what is your advice for local activists? And essentially that's what we are at AWS. We are a band of local activists. What's your advice for us on how we proceed? What can we be doing the greatest contribution to clean water and healthy rivers and a clean and healthy Anacostia?
Yeah, well, many of the things that you're already doing, but I would say, first of all, just be passionate about your local watershed. If everyone in this country adopted their local watershed as their passion and really focused on making it as healthy and vibrant as they possibly could, we could solve all of the water issues in this country just through that local activism. One of the things that I love about AWS is the engagement that you have with school kids, because getting the next generation connected to their watershed and passionate about protecting it is absolutely essential to making a great future for everyone. And so I definitely keep doing that, engaging your local policymakers, inviting the mayor and members of the city council to get out on a river cleanup or just get out on the river with AWS, I think is really important, and reaching out, even beyond the immediate watershed itself. I know that you guys are engaged in Annapolis and making sure, you've got a great opportunity with a new governor, new administration in Maryland to start making those connections, because, Annapolis is a long way from the Anacostia, and people may not think so much of it as being part of Maryland, but it involves your neighborhood in Maryland and even up where I live in Olney in Montgomery County as well. So I think making those connections is really important. And I'll say one last thing, which I had mentioned to Chris a week or so ago, which is I love the newsletter. The AWS newsletter. I find it just to be so well done and so informative. I read every issue, every page in it. I love reading about all of the projects that are going on. As a fly fisherman who loves to fish for shad in the spring, I love reading about the freshwater mussels that attach themselves to shad when they're little tiny babies, and it's just great. But that is such a great resource for keeping people informed too. So keep that up as well.
Well, thanks, Bob. Over the years, Bob has made 2 age-related observations that really made a huge impression on me. One was not long ago when Bob was standing in his living room perusing his book collection and made the observation that he will be long dead before he could read all of these books. And being as I'm only a few years younger than Bob, it was a very sobering observation that I took to heart. But the other observation, youth-related observation that he made one time, I don't even know if you remember this, Bob, we were talking about conservation and making the field of conservation more diverse. And the observation you made was you really have to start with the youth. You have to, through education programs and us as professionals, we need to bring young people into our organizations, including young people of color and young people of other sorts of diverse or historically marginalized or historically unjustly treated populations. We have to bring those folks into our organization as young people and give them an opportunity to advance. Which I've thought about that a lot over the years after you made that observation. I think that's incredibly true, and it's inspired some of the work that I do. So your thoughts about youth and the way we can involve people in the conservation of the Anacostia through our education programs and otherwise is really received, those observations. So with that, Bob, I really want to thank you for taking the time to be with us tonight on this Watershed Wednesday. I think I speak for all of us in saying that we really enjoyed hearing your thoughts and insights and getting the benefit of your experience on the Clean Water Act. We are about at time, but before we go, I did promise folks when I was talking up this event that you'd give us at least one good war story from your career. As those of us who work in conservation know, we use sort of war stories as shorthand for, running into some sort of intractable foe and conservation issue, or running into a recalcitrant staffer on the Hill when we were working to lobby an issue or whatever. So give us one juicy war story, Bob.
Okay, I'll tell you one story, which I know I've shared with you in the past, Chris, and that's when I worked in the Senate. I worked for Senator Max Baucus of Montana, who was the chairman of the Environment and Public Works Committee. And I used to tell this story when I was teaching law school classes to tell students that they would face moments of stress and they would be able to get through them and really benefit from them. We were on the Senate floor managing the reauthorization of the Safe Drinking Water Act. And Senator Bob Dole of Kansas decided to offer a surprise amendment that was going to weaken the wetlands provisions of the Clean Water Act, but do it through the Safe Drinking Water Act, which is what happens in the Senate, because there aren't any rules really. They have a bunch of rules, but they don't really. You can bring up anything at any time, which means that you have to always be ready for a surprise. And so this happened, and Senator Baucus turned to me. I was sitting next to him, and he turned to me and he said, and I'll paraphrase what he said. He's like, "What the F do we do? What the F do we do?" And I had about 15 seconds to come up with an answer of what to do. And fortunately, I did come up with an answer, and it actually worked. And so he was happy, and I was immensely relieved. But I used to tell my students, after that experience, nothing in life could be as stressful as that moment. And it was really good, because it made me realize that even when things seem stressful, you can get through them. And I think it's a good lesson, not just for work, but for life in general. Life throws a lot of things at you. There's a lot of things that can create immense stress in your life, but you just sort of plug away at it, and you get through it, and there'll be better things on the other side. And I think it's just a good thing to remember going forward.
Well, thank you, Bob, for sharing that story with us, and thank you for spending this last hour with us. We really appreciate it so much.
Well,
and thank you. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say it's my pleasure, and I really am proud to be part of Anacostia Watershed Society, and I appreciate all of you having me tonight and lending your ears for a while.
Again, thanks, Bob, and thanks to all of you for attending this Watershed Wednesday, and be sure to keep an eye out for announcements on what the next Watershed Wednesday is going to look like next month, and I hope we see you there. So thanks, everybody. Thank you all so much, and thanks for your continuing support of the Anacostia Watershed Society.
From Mimi Jersey,
Good night.
Good night.
Aaron Costello, Messiah,